The page itself is a particular kind of object. It is dense with figures, organized in columns, and printed in the double column format that the Journal of the American Medical Association used in 1950, when every article arrived on paper and was read under a lamp. At the top of the page, two names, Ernst Winder and Everts Graham. Below the names, a title that would become one of the most consequential in 20th century medicine. And in the first paragraph, visible at a glance even before reading begins, a number, 684. That number represents the count of men whose medical histories were gathered, examined, and then arranged into tables. Men who had come to hospitals with lung cancer and whose answers to questions about their smoking habits had begun to form a shape that the researchers could not ignore. The study had taken years to assemble. Winder was a young medical student when he began it, still training, still learning to read the clinical record for patterns that his professors had not yet named. Graham was his supervisor, a thoracic surgeon at Washington University in St. Louis, who had spent years operating on lungs and who had grown curious about what was happening to them. Together they designed a straightforward instrument, a questionnaire, administered to patients with confirmed lung cancer, asking them how much they smoked and for how long. The same questionnaire went to a comparison group, patients in the same hospitals without the disease. The results accumulated slowly, one patient record at a time, until there were enough of them to see clearly what the data described. When the paper appeared in JAMA in May 1950, the figures in its tables were difficult to look away from. Among the 684 lung cancer patients, 96.5% were moderate to heavy smokers. The comparison group showed no such concentration. The disparity was not slight. It was not the kind of difference that could be attributed easily to chance or to some unmeasured variable in the background. It was the kind of difference that statistical analysis is designed to make visible, and it was visible in these tables with a plainness that the numbers themselves provided, without any rhetorical assistance from the researchers who had arranged them. The paper was careful. Winder and Graham did not claim certainty. The language of the study was the language of correlation, of association, of a relationship that the data described and that further research would need to examine. But the shape of the thing was there, set down in print, in a journal that physicians across the country received by mail and read at their desks. A finding had entered the record. It would not leave. In London, a physician named Richard Dahl had been reading similar signals in the clinical literature and had begun thinking about how to trace them forward into something more certain. Dahl was working with Austin Bradford Hill, a statistician and epidemiologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, whose methodological rigor had already shaped the design of the first modern randomized controlled trial in medicine. The two of them, in 1951, launched what would become known as the British Doctors' Study, an effort so large in its ambition and so patient in its construction that it would continue accumulating data for the next 50 years. The design was an act of epidemiological patience. Dahl and Hill wrote to the entire registered medical profession of the United Kingdom, asking each physician to describe their current smoking habits and to agree to be contacted again as the study progressed. Approximately 40,000 physicians responded. Their names and smoking histories were recorded. Then the researchers waited, tracking death certificates, matching causes of death against the original questionnaires, letting time do what no short study could accomplish. The British doctors who smoked were going to age. Some of them were going to develop lung cancer. The question was whether the ones who smoked would develop it at higher rates, and whether the rates would increase as the amount smoked increased. The initial findings came in 1954, published in the British Medical Journal. The data showed a clear dose-response relationship. Physicians who smoked more than 25 cigarettes a day died of lung cancer at rates that were orders of magnitude higher than those who did not smoke. Physicians who smoked fewer cigarettes fell at intermediate rates. Non-smokers showed the lowest rates of all. This pattern, the specific mathematical relationship between quantity smoked and probability of disease, was among the most important features of the early evidence. It was harder to explain away than a simple correlation. A dose-response curve suggests mechanism. It suggests that the thing being measured is not merely associated with the outcome, but is in some meaningful sense producing it. There is something particular about reading epidemiological tables at a distance of 70 years. The figures refer to men who have been dead for decades, physicians who answered a questionnaire in the early 1950s, who were young or middle-aged at the time, and who could not have known that their answers were contributing to a document that would outlast them. The columns of numbers in the British Medical Journal from 1954 are quiet in the way that demographic data is always quiet. They represent lives, but they represent them in aggregate as quantities. A bound copy of that journal, its pages lightly yellowed, its margins unmarked by the hand of whoever first read it, contains in its statistical tables a record of how men died, organized by the number of cigarettes they had smoked each day. Dahl would go on reading those tables for the rest of his professional life. The British doctor's study continued for decades after the first publication, and the data it gathered became progressively clearer with each successive analysis. The 1954 findings were a beginning. They established the relationship. What came after was the systematic thickening of the evidence into something that by the 1960s, no serious epidemiologist could reasonably dispute. At the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, a German-born physician named Wilhelm Huper had been working on the problem from a different angle. Huper was a specialist in the field of chemical carcinogenesis, the study of how specific chemicals in the environment produce cancer in exposed populations. He had written extensively on industrial carcinogens, on the relationship between occupational chemical exposure and specific cancers, and by the early 1950s, he had incorporated tobacco smoke into his analysis of chemical cancer-causing agents. His conclusions were clear and publicly stated. Tobacco smoke contains substances capable of producing malignant tumors in experimental animals, and the human evidence was consistent with the conclusion that smoking caused lung cancer. Huper worked inside a federal institution, which meant that his public statements existed in a complicated relationship with institutional authority. What the record shows is that pressure arrived, pressure that moved through administrative channels and ultimately resulted in restrictions on his ability to address tobacco and cancer in public forums. He was not silenced entirely, and the internal dynamics of how these restrictions came about have not been fully reconstructed from the available documents. What is clear is that by the early 1950s, Huper found his path to public speech on this particular question narrowed in ways that were connected, at least in part, to the commercial interests that had an obvious stake in the scientific questions he was addressing. His office in Bethesda remained his workplace. His manuscripts remained in their drawers. The research itself was not undone, but the route from that research to a public audience had become less straightforward than it had been before. Huper's case belongs to the early history of how the scientific record on tobacco was shaped, not yet by the elaborate institutional machinery that would come later, but by the simpler and older mechanism of professional pressure applied to an individual researcher inside an institution that was not immune to external influence. The documents that survive from his period at the National Cancer Institute do not provide a complete account of what happened. They record enough to establish that restrictions were placed on him. The full scope of what motivated those restrictions has remained, in certain respects, difficult to establish with precision from the available record alone. In 1953, Ernst Winder was back in his laboratory, this time at the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York, working on a different kind of question. The epidemiological studies by then had established a correlation in human populations, but correlation studies, however large and well designed, are subject to a particular line of objection. They establish association between two things measured in the same people. They cannot directly demonstrate that one thing is causing the other in the way that a controlled experiment can. What Winder and his colleagues wanted to know was whether tobacco smoke applied directly to biological tissue would produce cancer, whether the substance itself, in physical contact with cells, could cause them to become malignant. The experiment they designed was simple in its basic structure. Cigarette smoke was condensed into a tar. That tar was then applied repeatedly to the shaved backs of laboratory mice. The mice were observed over time. What the researchers found was that a substantial proportion of the mice developed malignant skin tumors at the sites of application. The results were published in 1953 in the journal Cancer Research. The paper provided something that the epidemiological studies, by their nature, could not: direct laboratory evidence that tobacco's chemical content was carcinogenic. This was not a statistical inference drawn from patterns in human populations. This was a tumor growing on a mouse at the precise location where tobacco tar had been applied. The mouse painting study, as it came to be known informally, was significant not merely because it confirmed the carcinogenic properties of tobacco smoke in a controlled setting. It was significant because it closed a logical gap in the chain of evidence. The human studies showed that smokers developed lung cancer at dramatically higher rates than non-smokers. The animal studies showed that tobacco tar, applied to tissue, produced malignant tumors. Together, these two bodies of evidence described a coherent picture, a picture that required for its interpretation some form of explanation other than coincidence. The stack of index cards on Winder's desk at Sloan Kettering in that period, each one bearing a patient number and a handwritten notation of cigarette consumption recorded in tight pencil strokes, represented something that their author perhaps understood only partially at the time. They were evidence. They were the raw material from which a case was being built, incrementally and carefully, by a researcher who had not yet seen the full shape of the resistance that evidence would eventually encounter. The cards themselves were just cards. The numbers on them were just numbers. But they described a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to attribute to anything other than the substance the patients had been putting into their lungs. The years between Winder and Graham's 1950 publication and the mid-1950s were years of accumulation. Evidence gathered in different places by different researchers using different methods, and the studies replicated and extended each other's findings rather than contradicting them. Animal experiments confirmed the carcinogenic properties of tobacco components. Epidemiological studies in multiple countries established the dose-response relationship in human populations. Researchers who had approached the question skeptically, hoping to find a more benign explanation for the lung cancer rise, found instead that the evidence consistently pointed in one direction. The scientific community in this period was not monolithic in its interpretation of the evidence. There were legitimate methodological debates about the strength of epidemiological inference, about the extent to which the animal studies translated to human biology, about how to weigh different kinds of evidence against each other. These debates were genuine, conducted among scientists who held varying views about the standards of proof that should govern causal claims in medicine. The debates were real, and for a period in the early 1950s, they were a genuine feature of the scientific landscape, not merely a manufactured appearance of controversy. What changed across that decade was the progressive resolution of those debates. As more studies came in, as the evidence from different methodological approaches converged, as the dose-response relationship was confirmed in additional populations, the weight of the scientific consensus shifted. The methodological objections became harder to sustain, not because they were answered definitively in a single study, but because the cumulative force of the evidence made them increasingly implausible as explanations for what was being observed. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the position among research scientists working in this area had moved from cautious association to confident causal inference. This convergence in the scientific literature was part of what made the events of January 11th, 1964 possible. On that morning, a Saturday, the Surgeon General of the United States released a report. The report was titled Smoking in Health. Luther Terry, the Surgeon General, had convened an expert advisory committee in 1962, comprising scientists with no prior public position on the tobacco question, and had tasked them with reviewing the entire accumulated literature, thousands of studies, human and animal and laboratory, from researchers on multiple continents. The committee had worked for over a year, meeting in the secure facilities of a government building to prevent leaks, its members forbidden from trading tobacco stocks during the course of the review. The report they produced was a document of considerable length and methodological care. It did not merely recount the findings of individual studies. It evaluated the criteria by which causation should be inferred from epidemiological evidence, criteria drawn in part from the established work of Bradford Hill, and applied those criteria systematically to the available data. The conclusion it reached was stated plainly in the report's summary. Cigarette smoking is causally related to lung cancer in men, not merely correlated, causally related. The federal government of the United States, through its chief medical officer, was stating formally and officially that smoking caused cancer. The choice of a Saturday for the release was not accidental. It was made specifically to allow the stock market a weekend's buffer before the news fully circulated in the financial world. The tobacco industry's stocks were publicly traded. A government report declaring that the industry's product caused cancer was the kind of news that moved markets, and the decision to release it when the exchanges were closed reflected an awareness that the information had economic consequences, not merely public health ones. The Saturday timing was one of many small, practical details surrounding the report's release that have been noted in subsequent accounts. A reminder that even a document as significant as this one had to navigate institutional realities that existed entirely outside the science it contained. The cover of the report was plain, a formal gray and white government document, the kind of thing that arrives in a government office and is stacked with other government documents on a conference table. On the evening of January 10th, 1964, the night before the release, copies of the report sat in a locked briefing room in Washington. The room was quiet. Outside, the city went about the evening's business. The conclusions inside those gray covers had been years in the forming, years of index cards and questionnaires, and statistical tables, and mouse painting experiments, and death certificate analyses. The evidence had been assembling itself, piece by piece, study by study, in the journals where scientists published their findings, and in the cumulative weight of replicated results for more than a decade before the Surgeon General's committee was convened. What the 1964 report represented was not a discovery but a formal public accounting. The scientific case had been building in plain sight, in the peer-reviewed literature, in the pages of JAMA, and the British Medical Journal and Cancer Research, accessible to anyone who read the journals and followed the statistical tables. The report gathered that case together and stated it in the language of official government medicine, the language that had the institutional weight to make the finding unavoidable, to move it from the scientific literature into the public record in a form that required a response. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the texture of what the research process had actually looked like across those years. Winder's index cards, the questionnaires mailed to 40,000 British physicians, the shaved backs of laboratory mice in a New York research institute, the filing cabinets at the NCI in Bethesda where Huper's manuscripts were ordered and waiting, the bound copies of statistical tables circulating in the mail to physicians' offices across Britain, Richard Dahl's desk at the Medical Research Council in London, where a draft of his 1954 findings rested in an institutional room, still, orderly, the kind of room where careful work was done without theatrical urgency. These were not dramatic spaces. They were workspaces where researchers sat with data and tried to understand what it meant. The understanding that emerged from those spaces was not simple, and it did not emerge quickly. The step from an observed correlation to a stated causal claim was one that the scientific community took carefully, and the debates about that step, about what kind of evidence was sufficient, about how to handle the methodological limitations of epidemiological inference, were genuine and lasted for years. The resolution of those debates, the gradual consolidation of the scientific community around a causal interpretation of the evidence, happened through the normal mechanisms of scientific discourse, replication, critique, alternative hypotheses tested and found insufficient, criteria for causation applied and found to be satisfied. None of this is the story of a simple truth that was obvious from the beginning and simply required courage to state. The scientific case on tobacco and lung cancer was built through sustained, methodologically careful work over more than a decade by researchers working at different institutions on different aspects of the question, whose findings happen to point consistently in the same direction. The convergence itself was the evidence, not any single study, however large, however well designed, but the pattern of consistent convergence across methods and populations and types of data. The British Medical Journal issue from 1954, containing Dahl and Hill's first published results from the doctor's study, would not, to a casual observer, look like a momentous document. It is a bound journal, the kind that fills the shelves of medical school libraries in long, undisturbed rows. Its pages are dense with text and tables. The article in question appears among other articles, in the normal way that scientific papers appear in journals, as one contribution among several in that issue's pages. There is nothing in its physical appearance that marks it as exceptional. What marks it as exceptional is only what it contains, and what it contains is discernible only to someone who reads the tables and understands their significance, the dose-response gradient, the consistency across different populations of physicians, the way the data sits against its comparison groups. This is how scientific evidence enters the world, not through announcement, not through revelation, but through publication, through the slow accumulation of papers and journals that are mailed to subscribers and sit on library shelves, through the reading and citation and replication that allows a finding to establish itself as something the field accepts rather than merely entertains. The finding that smoking caused lung cancer entered the world in exactly this way. It was present in the literature years before it was present in public consciousness. The tables that described the relationship existed in print, while the country that produced the tobacco, being studied, continued to smoke in large numbers, in a world where the scientific evidence and the public understanding had not yet arrived at the same place. The evening of January 10th, 1964, was the last night that Gap remained officially open. Luther Terry's report was in its locked briefing room, its conclusions settled, its copies already bound and counted, waiting for the morning press conference at which the Surgeon General would read its summary into the public record. Outside that room, the country continued as it had been. The cigarette advertising on television, the ashtrays in the hospital lounges, the promotional inserts in magazines, the rows of vending machines in hotel lobbies, stocked with their familiar packages. All of it continued on the evening of January 10th, as it had continued for years while the index cards were filled out and the questionnaire results were tabulated and the draft report circulated for review by committee members who had spent a year reading the literature. The report inside that locked room was not a beginning. It was, in one sense, a long accumulation, arriving at its formal expression, the point at which the weight of the scientific evidence, gathered across 15 years of careful inquiry, had been organized into the official language of federal medicine and was ready to be released into the morning. The room was quiet. The copies waited. The conclusions they contained had been made, set down, reviewed, and decided. What remained was only the turning of the hours towards Saturday morning, when the doors would open and the document would move from the sealed space of government record into the world that had not yet been told what the scientists had spent so long learning. The country sleeping on the night of January 10th, 1964, did not know what the morning would bring. The report was there, in its plain government cover, in its locked room, its pages ordered in the careful sequence of an official document, whose every sentence had been reviewed and approved and was ready to stand as the position of the federal government on the most consequential public health question of the century. It had come to that room from a long way, from a stack of index cards in a New York research institute, from a questionnaire mailed to physicians across Britain, from the shaved backs of laboratory mice, from the desk of a researcher in Bethesda, whose manuscripts sat in their drawers waiting for a path back to the public record. All of it had traveled through the slow medium of scientific publication and committee review to this room, this evening, this sealed and waiting gray and white cover. The morning was still hours away. The findings inside the covers had already been made. In a Louisville office building in 1963, a typed memorandum sits inside a Brown & Williamson legal file. The page bears the company's letterhead. Its author is Addison Yaman, general counsel, and in the measured prose of corporate legal correspondence, it states something that the company would spend the next 3 decades ensuring no one outside that building would read. Nicotine, the memo records, is addictive. The company, it acknowledges, is in the business of selling an addictive drug. The language is not alarmed. It is not apologetic. It reads the way a careful lawyer writes when setting down a private assessment of facts, plainly, precisely, and with the assumption that the page will remain where it has been placed. The file was closed. The cabinet was shut. The memo remained where it was. What makes that document worth sitting with is not only what it says, but the particular quality of its calm. Yemen was not confessing. He was not drafting a disclosure. He was writing the kind of internal assessment that legal departments produce when they need to understand the full dimensions of their situation, the kind of analysis that only has value if it is honest, and whose honesty becomes its most sensitive quality. The sentences about nicotine's addictive properties were written not because they were surprising to anyone in that room, but because they were accurate, and because the legal strategy being constructed around them required that someone, at least in private, acknowledge what was actually true. The file was indexed and stored, years accumulated around it. That gap between what was known inside the building and what was maintained outside it is the thing the record traces once the documents begin to speak. It is not a gap born of scientific uncertainty. The internal files from the major tobacco companies, viewed across the decades they span, show companies that were engaged in serious research into their own products, that received findings from their own scientists about the nature of nicotine and the mechanisms by which tobacco caused disease, and that built elaborate institutional structures specifically to ensure that those findings did not translate into what the public, regulators, or courts were allowed to know. The gap was maintained with effort. It required infrastructure. It required lawyers, public relations strategists, research committees, and a sustained commitment to speaking one language inside the building and a different one outside it. Yaman's memo was one document in a very large architecture. That architecture had a foundation, and its foundation was laid in 1954. In January of that year, the major American tobacco companies gathered in New York at the Plaza Hotel and met with John Hill, the founding partner of Hill & Knowlton, one of the most prominent public relations firms of the era. The meetings were prompted by what the industry had understood through the previous year's research was a genuine threat, not a threat to public health, but a threat to the industry's public position. Ernst Winder's 1953 mouse painting experiments at the Sloan Kettering Institute, which had produced malignant tumors by applying condensed cigarette tar to the skin of laboratory animals, had received substantial press coverage. The Winder study did not stand alone. It arrived alongside an accumulating body of human epidemiological work suggesting a relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer that was becoming difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Hill and Knowlton's advice to the assembled executives was documented in the strategy that emerged from those meetings. The approach they recommended did not involve denying the science outright. Outright denial would have been too easy to disprove and too obviously defensive. Instead, the strategy centered on what historians of the industry have since characterized as the manufacture of uncertainty, a deliberate effort to keep the scientific question appearing unresolved in the public mind for as long as that appearance could be sustained. The recommended vocabulary was the vocabulary of scientific caution. Company representatives and their surrogates would not say the research was wrong. They would say the research was incomplete. They would not say the scientists were mistaken. They would say the scientific community was divided. They would not say there was no link between smoking and cancer. They would say the link had not been conclusively established, and that the public deserved to wait for certainty before drawing conclusions. The language was precise. It was also chosen. 4 days after that Plaza Hotel meeting, on January 4th, 1954, a full-page advertisement appeared in more than 400 American newspapers. It ran in small towns and large cities, in regional papers, and in major urban dailies. Under the headline, "A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers," the advertisement carried the names of the major American tobacco companies as its signatories and addressed the public in the Register of Responsible Corporate Citizenship. The advertisement acknowledged that recent experiments had raised questions about tobacco's relationship to health. It stated that the companies took those questions seriously. It pledged that the industry would support and finance independent scientific research into the matter. It assured readers that the health and welfare of the public had always been and would continue to be a paramount concern. It described the existing evidence as inconclusive. The advertisement was printed on white newsprint in clean, readable type. Its language was sober and its tone was measured. It read, in the context of its time, as the response of an industry willing to engage in good faith with a difficult question. The companies whose names appeared at the bottom of that page had at that moment already received scientific assessments from inside their own research operations that the advertisement's language did not reflect. The private files and the public pledge occupied different worlds on that January morning, and the architecture of the gap between them had just been given its most visible public expression. The frank statement was one face of a structure. The other face was the organization announced alongside it, the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which would later be renamed the Council for Tobacco Research, was presented to the public as the institutional embodiment of the frank statement's pledge, an independent body that would fund rigorous scientific research and ensure that the question of tobacco and health was investigated with full integrity. Its founding documents described its purpose in the language of scientific openness. It was framed as evidence that the industry was not running from the question, but engaging it. The scientific community was told that funding was available and that the research agenda would be set by scientists, not executives. The organization had a scientific director. It produced annual reports. It awarded grants. What the public record did not show, and what the internal documents eventually confirmed, was that the Council for Tobacco Research operated in parallel with a second, undisclosed program. Inside the organization, and known to a restricted group of company executives and their legal counsel, there existed what internal documents referred to as special projects, a separate stream of research funding that did not appear in the organization's public reports, and that was not operated according to the independent scientific principles the Council's public face proclaimed. The Special Projects Program directed money to scientists and researchers whose work served a specific function, not to investigate the science of tobacco and health, but to produce findings and arguments that could be deployed to challenge, complicate, and undermine the studies that were establishing tobacco's harms. The grant applications looked like science. The products of the grants looked like science. But the selection criteria, as the internal documents record, were not scientific. They were strategic. The routing of those documents through legal counsel was not incidental. It was the method. By channeling the special projects, communications, and funding decisions through outside attorneys, the companies achieved something specific: the protection of attorney-client privilege. Documents that passed through legal counsel could be characterized as privileged legal communications rather than corporate records. If a court ever ordered disclosure of internal tobacco company documents, the most sensitive materials, the ones that showed what the companies actually knew, and the ones that showed how the Council for Tobacco Research's public independence was managed in private, could be shielded behind a legal designation that the outside world had no easy mechanism to challenge. The use of the phrase "under the tent," which appears in several documents from this period, described the practice of routing sensitive scientific communications through legal counsel specifically to accomplish this protection. The tent had walls that held for decades. British American Tobacco, operating from its research center in Southampton, England, maintained a biological research division that pursued serious and sophisticated science from the 1960s onward. The Southampton Center's scientists worked on questions of carcinogenesis, the cellular mechanisms by which chemical exposure produced malignant transformation, and the pharmacology of nicotine, how the compound moved through the body, how it crossed the blood-brain barrier, how its effects were modulated by dosage and delivery. The research was not superficial. It employed skilled scientists working with the methods of their time. It produced findings. Some of those findings confirmed, in the company's own laboratory data, the kinds of links between tobacco constituents and disease processes that the company was, through its public representatives and industry organizations, simultaneously characterizing as unproven. The research division's findings circulated internally. Some were published, findings that the company judge did not add materially to the unfavorable picture, while others remained within the company's files. The distinction between what was published and what was not a distinction between rigorous and preliminary science. It was a distinction between findings whose release would damage the company's position and findings whose release would not. That distinction was not made by scientists. It was made by people who understood what the company needed the public record to look like. A long hallway ran through the Southampton Center, its frosted glass doors and overhead fluorescent lights familiar to anyone who had worked in a British research facility of that era. The corridor was, by every account that survives, an ordinary place, a place of instruments and results and careful notation, of colleagues passing in white coats, of the day-to-day texture of methodical laboratory work. The science conducted inside it was real science. Its products lived in two separate worlds, the filed report and the sealed file. Across the Atlantic, in the Liggett Group's research operations, a similar pattern was taking shape. Liggett's internal scientists, working through the 1970s and into the 1980s, had examined the pharmacological mechanisms of nicotine dependence with sufficient rigor to reach conclusions about its addictive character that went well beyond what the company acknowledged publicly. The documents that survived from this period record a scientific understanding of nicotine's role in tobacco use, its capacity to sustain compulsive consumption, to create dependence that outlasted any individual's initial decision to smoke, to reshape the neurological conditions under which a person experienced the absence of the drug, that was detailed and carefully supported. The scientists who produced this work were employed by the company. Their findings were the company's property. Their conclusions, in the files where they were stored, described a product whose central commercially exploited feature was its addictive character. Those conclusions were withheld from the public, from regulators, from courts. What the record shows across these companies and through these decades is not a case of individual scientists choosing to obscure their findings out of personal dishonesty. The structure was institutional. The decisions about what circulated and what did not were made at levels above the research divisions by people who understood both the science and its commercial and legal implications. The individual scientist working in a Southampton laboratory or a Liggett research facility may have understood very little about what happened to the reports they submitted. The decisions about routing, privilege, and public disclosure were made elsewhere, in legal departments, in executive offices, in meetings with outside counsel, whose records were themselves carefully managed. The system was designed to preserve the gap. Each component served that purpose. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the tobacco industry had developed a Washington presence that matched its commercial scale. The Tobacco Institute, founded in 1958, provided the institutional framework for coordinating the industry's relationship with Congress, with regulatory agencies, and with the press. Its headquarters stood on a street near the Capitol in a building whose exterior offered no indication of what its interior contained, a full lobbying and public relations operation, its staff tracking legislative developments, monitoring scientific publications, preparing briefing materials for member company executives, and maintaining a detailed picture of the political and regulatory landscape as it bore on the industry's interests. The Tobacco Institute's work was not secret in the way that the internal research documents were secret. Lobbying organizations operate in public. Their staffs are known. Their reports in some form are filed. But the internal documents of the Tobacco Institute, which became available as part of the 1998 Master Settlement Agreements, document disclosure requirements, showed the specific texture of how the organization's public positions were constructed and maintained. The briefing materials prepared for company spokespersons did not simply summarize the industry's position. They trained those spokespersons in the precise deployment of a particular vocabulary, the language of scientific uncertainty, of inconclusive evidence, of the need to wait for more research before drawing conclusions. The documents record how that vocabulary was calibrated, how it was updated as new scientific findings required new responses, and how it was designed to function not as a description of the actual state of scientific knowledge, but as a way of presenting the question that served the industry's position. The press clippings that arrived each morning on the desks of Tobacco Institute staff were annotated. The scientific publications that reported new findings on smoking and health were tracked. Each significant new study was assessed for what response it required, whether the response should be a counter-study, a public statement about methodological limitations, a communication to congressional allies, or simply silence. The architecture of the response was not improvised. It was managed. Inside that management, one of the most consistent tools was the funding of alternative research. The special projects stream within the Council for Tobacco Research was one mechanism. The Tobacco Institute maintained its own relationships with scientists and researchers whose work could be cited when the industry's public representatives needed to invoke the language of ongoing scientific debate. These were not all cynical scientists. Some genuinely held views that differed from the emerging consensus, but the industry's support for them was not based on their scientific independence. It was based on what their published work could be used to say, and the internal documents are clear enough about that distinction to make it difficult to read the pattern any other way. The industry's management of scientific communication extended to the meetings and journals of the scientific community itself. Internal documents record efforts to place favorable papers in peer-reviewed publications, to ensure that industry-funded scientists presented at major conferences, and to cultivate relationships with journal editors who could be relied upon to give a sympathetic reading to submissions whose methodology the broader scientific community would have found wanting. The strategy understood that the appearance of scientific legitimacy required presence in the institutions of legitimate science. A finding published in a peer-reviewed journal looked like peer-reviewed science. The question of how the paper arrived at that journal, who had funded the research, and what selection criteria had determined that this particular study was worth conducting, was a question that the public, and in many cases the journal's own readers, had no way to answer. Decades produced a very large body of this material. The Addison-Yaman memo, with its frank acknowledgement of what the company was actually selling, existed within a world that had constructed an extraordinarily elaborate public version of a different reality. The memo was not the only document of its kind. The Brown and Williamson legal files contained correspondence, research assessments, and strategy documents that, taken together, showed a company that had maintained a private understanding of its product's properties for years while its public representatives described those same properties as scientifically unresolved. The company's lawyers had understood early that these documents were sensitive. The routing systems and privilege designations that protected them were not improvised responses to a litigation threat. They were built in advance of the litigation, at a time when the company's legal counsel could see what the files contained and could project what exposure they would create if they were ever read by a court. The cabinet that held those files in Louisville sat in a building that looked, from the outside, like any other corporate office building. Its floors were organized in the ordinary way: administrative offices, conference rooms, a reception area, the company's public face maintained with the equipment of ordinary corporate life. The legal department occupied its own floor or section, its staff engaged in the work that legal departments do. The files they maintained were labeled in the way that files are labeled: alphanumeric codes, case numbers, dates. A person walking through that department who did not know what they were looking at would have seen nothing unusual. The management of sensitive information looked at the institutional level exactly like the management of any other corporate information. That was part of its design. The gap between the private files and the public record was not a crack in an otherwise honest system. It was a managed space, tended continuously, requiring regular effort to maintain. Each new scientific finding that confirmed the links between tobacco and disease required a calibrated response. Each new legislative development required a lobbying strategy. Each congressional hearing required preparation, the kind of preparation that legal counsel provides when witnesses need to answer questions in ways that do not cross into statements the law would find actionable. The system was designed for exactly the kind of sustained, decades-long maintenance that it received. In 1963, the same year Yeaman wrote his memo, the scientific and regulatory pressure on the tobacco industry was building in ways that its architecture was increasingly required to manage. The Surgeon General's Advisory Committee had been at work for months. Its report was coming, and the industry knew it was coming, and the internal documents from this period show an industry calculating what the report would mean and how the public response to it should be shaped. The preparation was institutional. The response that followed the report's release was coordinated, calibrated, and deployed through the infrastructure that had been built over the previous decade for exactly this purpose. The documents that record this preparation are not dramatic. They read like the planning records of a large organization managing a significant operational challenge, which is, in the most neutral description, what they were. The challenge was that the science was moving in a direction the industry could not stop, and the task was to ensure that the movement of the science did not translate proportionally into movement in the public's understanding, in the regulator's authority, or in the legislature's willingness to act. The documents record specific decisions about specific responses. They do not read as the work of people who were uncertain about what the science actually showed. They read as the work of people who understood the science well enough to plan against it. That understanding is present in the Yeaman memo. It is present in the internal research documents from British American Tobacco's Southampton laboratories. It is present in the Liggett files and in the Tobacco Institute's briefing materials and in the routing instructions that sent sensitive communications through legal counsel to be shielded under privilege. The understanding was institutional, distributed across multiple companies and their shared infrastructure, maintained by people who in some cases worked only in one small part of the system, and in other cases had a view of the whole. The gap between what was known and what was said was not a secret in the ordinary sense, the kind of secret held by a small number of individuals who carry it privately and feel its weight. It was an institutional condition, maintained by structure, rather than by individual conscience, sustained, not because every person who contributed to it had made a deliberate choice to deceive, but because the system they worked within had been designed to produce that result, and had been producing it reliably for years. The Frank Statement's promise of open and independent research had its own kind of reliability. It was reproduced wherever the industry's public representatives needed to invoke the industry's good faith. It was cited in congressional testimony. It was referenced in press statements. It was the public face of an organization, the Council for Tobacco Research, that carried the architecture of the promise inside it, while directing a separate stream of resources toward the specific work of complicating and challenging the science the promise claimed to support. The special projects line in the budget was not visible in the annual report. The recipients were not listed by name in any public document. The connection between the Council's independent public image and its privately managed research agenda was a connection that the Council's own governance structure was designed to make impossible to see from the outside. That invisibility required maintenance. It required the annual reports to look like the reports of an independent scientific organization. It required the scientists who received grants through the public channel to have no knowledge of the special projects channel. It required the company executives who understood the full picture to manage the boundary between what their public representatives said and what their internal files recorded. The management was continuous. The architecture held because people at multiple levels of the system were doing the work of holding it, many of them without understanding the full shape of what they were holding. The full shape is visible now, or visible enough. The internal files that capture it were produced by the companies themselves, by their scientists, their lawyers, their executives, their public relations strategists. They are the record of a private world that was constructed in parallel with the public world the industry presented, and that was maintained through specific mechanisms, specific decisions, and specific language for decades. They do not require interpretation to establish their basic character. The Yemen Memo says what it says. The special projects documents describe what they describe. The British American Tobacco Laboratory reports record the findings they record. The Tobacco Institute briefing materials contain the instructions they contain. The documents are the gap, rendered in the industry's own words. On the morning of January 4th, 1954, readers across America opened their newspapers and found, spread across a full inside page, the frank statement to cigarette smokers. In hundreds of towns, the same advertisement occupied the same position in the same format, its reassuring language filling the space that newspapers reserved for the advertisers who paid for it. The pledges ran in clean prose under a headline of sincerity. The corporate names at the bottom were the names of companies whose products were already in millions of American homes, whose brands were already part of the daily texture of ordinary life. The advertisement looked, in the context of its moment, like what it claimed to be, a responsible industry taking a difficult question seriously and committing itself to finding the answer. The private files that existed behind those names on that morning already told a different story. The research that had been conducted, the assessments that had been made, the understanding that had been built, all of it sat in drawers and cabinets in buildings that the advertisement's readers would never enter, Kamalang the inn, whose existence the advertisement did not acknowledge, and whose contents its language was specifically designed to preclude the public from demanding. The gap between the advertisement and the files was the size of decades. It was the size of a public health crisis that the files understood and the advertisement denied. It was on that January morning entirely invisible from the outside. The advertisement ran. The files stayed closed. The cabinets held what they had been built to hold. In the early 1960s, the Tobacco Institute occupied a formal building on a quiet street in Washington, D.C., close enough to the Capitol that its staff could walk to committee hearings on mornings when the weather permitted. The lobby was furnished simply, industry publications arranged in neat fans on low tables near the entrance, the reception desk attended, the phone lines in steady use. A hallway ran from the front entrance to a series of offices where lobbyists sat at desks, reviewing legislative calendars and clipping the previous day's science reporting from newspapers, folded to the relevant pages. The building had a particular quality that characterized many Washington offices of that era, which was the quality of a place where most of the consequential work was conducted by paper letters, drafted, memoranda circulated, briefing documents assembled and reviewed before being carried to the Hill. One of those briefing documents, sitting open on a desk near a window facing the street, concerned an upcoming congressional hearing on tobacco and health. The document was detailed. It outlined recommended language for testimony, anticipated questions from committee members, and offered specific framings for disputed scientific findings. The framings were not invented. They were drawn from a strategy that had been under careful development since at least the mid-1950s, a strategy built not around denying the science directly, but around placing the science in permanent, productive question. The Tobacco Institute had been founded in 1958 as the primary lobbying and public relations arm of the American tobacco industry. Its founding documents described a trade association operating in the public interest, committed to research and the fair presentation of evidence. The internal documents the Institute produced and filed over the following 4 decades described something more specific than that. Those documents, which would not become publicly accessible until the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement required their disclosure, showed how the Institute coordinated industry messaging on health questions across multiple companies, how it trained company spokespersons to deploy particular scripts when asked about the relationship between smoking and disease, and how it maintained a detailed tracking system for scientific publications that posed a threat to the industry's public position. The system was methodical. A paper published in a medical journal would be noted, assessed, and incorporated into briefing materials that reached industry representatives within days of its appearance in print. The strategy the Institute was supporting had a longer history than the Institute itself. In late 1953, following the publication of the mouse painting experiments at Sloan Kettering, experiments that had produced malignant tumors in laboratory animals by applying condensed cigarette tar to shaved skin, the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton was engaged by the tobacco industry to manage what its representatives understood to be a crisis. The crisis was not, precisely, that the science had become more convincing. The crisis was that the science had begun to reach the general public in a form that was producing anxiety among consumers, and that anxiety was measurable in sales figures and in the volume of concerned letters reaching company offices. Hill & Knowlton's recommended approach became known in the documents that eventually emerged from this period as the controversy strategy. The name was accurate to what the strategy produced, though it described it somewhat neutrally. The substance of the strategy was to ensure that the scientific record on tobacco and health appeared, to the general public and to legislators, perpetually unsettled, not refuted, not confirmed, but contested in ways that made authoritative pronouncements seem premature. The mechanism was not simply to argue against findings that were inconvenient. The mechanism was to occupy the ground of scientific caution itself, to speak the language of methodological scruple and evidentiary care, and to do so in ways that positioned the industry as the defender of rigorous inquiry rather than the opponent of it. The practical expression of this required people who could speak credibly in the register of science. Hill and Knowlton's internal documents from the mid-1950s outlined the recommended approach to testimony before congressional committees and described the preferred vocabulary for industry representatives when addressing research that linked smoking to disease. The vocabulary was specific. Representatives were advised to emphasize the complexity of causation, to note the distinction between correlation and proof, to reference the ongoing work of industry-sponsored researchers, and to characterize definitive conclusions as premature given the state of the evidence. These were not individually dishonest statements. A 1953 journal article, taken in isolation, did not constitute proof of causation. The larger body of evidence, assembled across hundreds of studies over more than a decade, did. The strategy depended on ensuring that individual studies were always assessed individually, never in accumulation. The Council for Tobacco Research had been established in 1954 under the name the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. Its public function was to support independent scientific investigation of questions related to tobacco and health. Its founding announcement described it as a body committed to open inquiry, staffed by scientists operating free of industry direction. The external scientific advisory board the council maintained included researchers with genuine credentials and genuine independence, which served an important purpose. Their presence made the council's other activities harder to characterize as purely strategic. The council did fund research. Some of that research was conducted in good faith and produced findings that were published in peer-reviewed journals without editorial interference from the industry. The part of the council's operation that did not appear in its public materials was a funding stream, the internal documents referred to as special projects. The documents that described this stream were marked for restricted circulation and were routed, where possible, through legal counsel to preserve the protection of attorney-client privilege. The special projects stream funded researchers and legal strategies that were selected not primarily for their scientific merit, but for their utility in the ongoing project of manufacturing scientific uncertainty. The work funded through this stream was targeted at specific studies that had produced damaging findings, at methodological critiques designed to accompany and undermine particular publications, and at the development of alternative explanatory frameworks that could be offered as substitutes for the straightforward relationship between smoking and lung cancer. The filing cabinet containing the council's internal documents on special projects sat in an office whose contents remained inaccessible to the public for decades. The cabinet's contents were known in their outlines to the people who had created and managed the program, and to the legal teams that had advised on structuring it to resist disclosure. They were not known to the journalist covering tobacco policy, to the members of Congress who received testimony from council representatives, or to the physicians and patients who read in industry communications that the evidence remained inconclusive. One document from the council's internal files bears particular attention for what it establishes about how the Special Projects Program was conceived. It is an internal planning document whose recipients are identified only by initials, and it describes the selection criteria for special projects funding in language that reads, on its surface, like a grant application. The language emphasizes scientific rigor, methodological soundness, and the importance of independent evaluation. Moving through the document more carefully, the selection criteria reveal themselves to be organized not around the quality of proposed research, but around its strategic orientation, its capacity to generate findings that could be placed in opposition to the accumulating consensus, and its capacity to produce materials that could be used in regulatory hearings and court proceedings. The document's language is careful. It does not say any of this plainly. The record shows it clearly enough. The same structural principle that animated the controversy strategy, the occupation of scientific language for purposes that were not primarily scientific, shaped how the industry managed the testimony of its own representatives before Congress through the 1970s and 1980s and into the 1990s. Company executives and scientists who appeared before legislative committees during this period were extensively prepared by legal counsel before their testimony. The preparation covered the specific formulations they should use when asked about the relationship between nicotine and addiction, about the relationship between smoking and cancer, and about what their company's internal researchers had found. The preparation also covered what they should not say, which was, in several important respects, considerably more than what they were prepared to say. The moment that captured most of this preparation and its results in a single documented event occurred on April 14, 1994, in a hearing room in the Rayburn House office building, where the House Subcommittee on Health and the Environment had convened to receive testimony from the chief executives of 7 major American tobacco companies. The hearing room was arranged in the standard configuration for congressional testimony. The witness table, long and equipped with microphones, each seat occupied by a name placard and a glass of water, and behind each executive, seated just past the left shoulder, a member of the legal team that had prepared the testimony being delivered that morning. The 7 executives were to observe them, a row of formally dressed men who maintained a consistent manner across the hours of the hearing, composed, measured, and attentive to precision in their language, in ways that reflected the months of preparation their legal teams had provided. The chair of the subcommittee, Representative Henry Waxman of California, had organized the hearing's central question around a single subject, and one by one, he posed versions of that question to each of the 7 witnesses seated before him. The question was whether nicotine was addictive. Each of the 7 executives, asked in turn, testified under oath that he did not believe nicotine was addictive. The testimony was unanimous and synchronized, not because the executives had coordinated their answers in advance at the witness table, but because each of them had been prepared through extensive legal preparation to give precisely this answer using precisely this formulation. The preparation had been organized around a specific legal strategy. The word addictive, as the executives used it in their testimony, was being deployed in a technical, clinical sense, a sense narrow enough to distinguish nicotine's effects from the pharmacological definition of addiction as it appeared in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The executives' legal preparation had ensured that their testimony was technically defensible within the strictest reading of that clinical definition, while conveying to anyone listening without specialized knowledge that their companies had found no evidence that nicotine was anything other than a normal substance with normal effects. The company's internal researchers had found exactly the opposite. The memos, reports, and research summaries that would eventually emerge from the corporate archives documented a body of company-commissioned research on nicotine pharmacology that went back decades. The findings in those internal documents were not preliminary or tentative. They were detailed, specific, and in several cases, produced by scientists who had spent careers studying the mechanisms of dependence. The findings confirmed that nicotine was addictive in the fullest clinical sense, that the industry's products had been formulated with awareness of this, and that the addictive properties of nicotine were not an incidental feature of cigarettes, but a commercially significant one. These findings were in the files on the day the 7 executives sat down at the witness table. The testimony they gave that morning bore no relationship to what those files contained. The Tobacco Institute's internal tracking of congressional activity during this same period provides a complementary picture of how thoroughly the lobbying operation had been built to maintain the gap between what the companies knew and what they were prepared to acknowledge in public. The Institute's staff monitored legislative developments relevant to tobacco across all 50 state legislatures, as well as the Congress, maintained relationships with committee staff on both sides of the aisle, and produced regular intelligence reports summarizing which members of Congress were considered reliably supportive, which were considered persuadable, and which were considered firmly in opposition to the industry's position on regulatory questions. The reports were candid in ways that the Institute's public communications were not. Where the Institute's press materials spoke of supporting balanced scientific inquiry and opposing unnecessary regulatory burdens, the internal reports spoke of protecting specific legislative positions, managing particular congressional relationships, and anticipating the likely behavior of named members during committee markups of pending bills. The reports were circulated within the industry and through the Institute to company representatives who needed to understand the legislative environment in which their own lobbying activities were operating. The files documenting this circulation were labeled and organized. They survived. The 1958 charter that established the Tobacco Institute described a trade association whose purpose was to advance the interests of tobacco manufacturers in ways consistent with the public good. The documents filed in the Institute's own archives over the following 4 decades described a more specific purpose, which was to maintain, against the accumulating weight of scientific evidence, a public position that the relationship between tobacco and disease remained unproven, and to deploy every available legal, political, and communicative resource in support of that position for as long as it could be sustained. The legal structures that supported the industry's public position were as carefully maintained as the communication structures. The use of attorney-client privilege to shield sensitive research from discovery had been built into the Council for Tobacco Research's Special Projects program from its inception. The routing of internal scientific communications through outside legal counsel, a practice the documents would eventually identify, using the phrase "under the tent," had been established to ensure that research findings that confirmed tobacco's harmful and addictive properties could be classified as legal work product rather than scientific data subject to disclosure in regulatory proceedings or civil litigation. The documents that carried the phrase "under the tent" in their routing instructions were not hidden in the conventional sense. They were filed, ordered, and accessible to those within the relevant privilege structure. They were simply inaccessible to everyone else. The scale of the documentation that eventually emerged from these systems, when the legal framework shielding it were eventually overcome, gave some indication of how much material had passed through these channels. Millions of pages of internal research, correspondence, legal analysis, and strategic planning had been produced, circulated, and filed in ways designed to keep them beyond the reach of courts, regulators, and the public. The physical volume of what had been accumulated across decades of industry operation was, in the documents that described it, a measure not of transparency, but of its opposite. The legal history of tobacco regulation runs alongside the lobbying history the Tobacco Institute's files document, and the two histories illuminate each other at a number of specific points. In the years following the 1964 Surgeon General's report, various federal agencies explored the possibility of regulatory authority over tobacco products. The Federal Trade Commission moved to require health warnings on cigarette packages. The Food and Drug Administration considered the question of whether nicotine could be classified as a drug. In each case, the tobacco industry's response was coordinated across its legal, lobbying, and public relations operations. And in each case, the response was organized around the same fundamental claim that the evidence of harm was not sufficiently established to warrant regulatory action, and that any regulatory action that was taken represented government overreach into a lawful industry. The legal arguments supporting these positions were sophisticated. They drew on genuine points of administrative law and genuine ambiguities in the regulatory statutes the agencies were attempting to apply. They were not simply delay tactics dressed in legal language, though they produced delay as one of their consistent results. They were also, in a number of cases, successful on their own legal terms. The courts that considered them found them persuasive, and the regulatory agencies that encountered them found their path to authority more complicated than they had anticipated. The Supreme Court's 2000 ruling in FDA Vert forced Brown and Williamson concluded that the FDA lacked statutory authority to regulate tobacco products under the existing federal food and drug laws, a ruling that reflected the genuine complexity of the administrative law questions the industry's lawyers had identified and pursued. The effect of the legal strategy was not simply to delay regulation, though its effect on the timeline of regulation was substantial. The effect was also to ensure that the public debate about tobacco and health was consistently structured in ways that favored the industry's position, a regulatory proceeding that ended inconclusively, a court ruling that found against an agency on jurisdictional grounds, a congressional hearing at which industry representatives maintained their uniform position about the state of the evidence. Each of these events produced news coverage and public record that reinforced the appearance of a genuine, unresolved scientific controversy. The appearance of genuine controversy, maintained for decades across thousands of individual moments of public communication, was itself one of the strategy's primary outputs. In 2006, in the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., U.S. District Judge Gladys Kessler issued a ruling in the case of United States v. Philip Morris USA et al. That was, in its specifics and its length, an exhaustive examination of the gap between the industry's public position and its private knowledge. The ruling ran to 1,683 pages. It was written in the even precise register of judicial opinion, findings of fact, documented in specific terms, legal conclusions drawn from those facts through the applicable standards, the results stated clearly and without interpretive elaboration beyond what the analysis required. The ruling found that the major tobacco companies had violated the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act by engaging in a decades-long conspiracy to defraud the American public about the health risks of smoking, the addictive properties of nicotine, and their practices in marketing to young people. The ruling covered territory across a span of decades. It traced the development of the controversy strategy. It documented the Council for Tobacco Research's Special Projects Program and the use of attorney-client privilege to shield research from discovery. It addressed the 1994 congressional testimony and the legal preparation that had preceded it. It considered the Tobacco Institute's lobbying and public communications operations. Page by page, in the careful language of judicial findings, it laid out what the record showed about the distance between what the industry had known and what the industry had said. The document was public record. The ruling was a federal court's account of what the files confirmed. The passage in the ruling that addressed the 1994 congressional testimony was brief by the document's standards, perhaps 15 pages in a text of 1,683, but its language was precise about what the testimony had been and what the companies had known when they delivered it. The executives who had testified that they did not believe nicotine was addictive were, Judge Kessler found, aware of internal research that established addiction as a central feature of their products. The preparation their legal counsel had provided had been organized specifically to allow them to testify in ways that were technically defensible while conveying an impression at odds with their company's actual knowledge. The finding was stated in the Judicial Register, which is to say plainly and without emphasis, near page 400, in a section addressing document management and destruction. The ruling described specific instances in which internal tobacco industry documents had been destroyed or withheld from discovery proceedings. The language in that section was precise about what the record established, which documents from which companies, under which legal direction, on what timeline. The destruction of documents is a distinct act from the concealment of findings, and the ruling treated it as such, examining the evidence for each on its own terms, without collapsing the two into a single characterization. What the record showed was that both had occurred, each documented in its own way, each addressed by the ruling in turn. The Master Settlement Agreement, signed in November 1998 between 46 states and the four largest American tobacco companies, had preceded the Kessler ruling by 8 years and had emerged from a different legal process, not a federal government prosecution, but a wave of state-level civil suits organized around the costs that state Medicaid programs had incurred treating smoking-related illnesses. The settlement's terms included a payment of not less than $206 billion over a period of 25 years, advertising and marketing restrictions that applied to particular formats and audiences, and requirements for the dissolution of the Tobacco Institute and the Council for Tobacco Research. The settlement also required the companies to fund the creation of a permanent public depository for internal tobacco industry documents, a requirement that transformed the private files of the major companies into a publicly accessible archive whose contents researchers anywhere in the world could examine. The physical document of the settlement itself, a dense indexed text bearing the signatures of state attorneys general from 46 states along the right margin of its final pages, with schedules and addenda running to considerable length, was, at the moment of its signing, the largest civil litigation settlement in American history. The signatures on its final pages represented years of parallel legal proceedings conducted in jurisdictions across the country, each proceeding contributing in its own way to the pressure that eventually brought the companies to the negotiating table. The attorneys general whose names appeared in that column of signatures on the right margin had pursued litigation strategies that varied in their specific approaches, but converged on a shared result: the formal, written acknowledgement, embedded in a legally binding agreement, that the tobacco industry owed the public a debt measurable in billions of dollars and in decades of information withheld. The dissolution of the Tobacco Institute and the Council for Tobacco Research, required by the settlement's terms, ended two of the most consequential institutional structures the industry had built for managing its public position. The Tobacco Institute closed its Washington office in 1999. The staff who had staffed its phones and maintained its files dispersed. The files themselves, under the settlement's provisions, became part of the documentary record, now being assembled into what would eventually be accessible at the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library. The lobby where the industry publications had been arranged in neat fans on low tables was, before long, occupied by other tenants. The controversy strategy the Institute had supported for 4 decades did not disappear with the organization that had been one of its primary vehicles. The strategy had been institutionalized across a wide range of structures, communications approaches, legal frameworks, research funding mechanisms that existed independently of any single organization. The documents the settlement made public showed, among other things, how thoroughly the approach had been replicated across the industry's various components, so that the dissolution of any individual institution left the underlying pattern largely intact. Researchers who later analyzed the tobacco documents would identify specific methodological signatures of the controversy strategy, the emphasis on individual studies over accumulated evidence, the cultivation of alternative hypotheses, the use of scientific language to describe positions that were not primarily scientific, and find them reappearing in the communications of other industries confronting adverse scientific findings in later decades. The documents were useful for this purpose precisely because they were specific and detailed. They showed not only that the strategy had been employed, but how it had been developed, refined, and applied across a range of regulatory and legal contexts over many years. The Kessler ruling's corrective advertising requirement, which was among the remedies Judge Kessler ordered as a consequence of the RICO finding, took 11 years to implement. The tobacco companies challenged the specific wording of the required disclosures through years of additional litigation, a process that itself illustrated the durability of the legal resources the industry continued to bring to its public position, even after the RICO finding against it. When the corrective statements finally appeared in major American newspapers, on company websites, and in television advertisements beginning in November 2017, they were printed under specific headings that Judge Kessler had ordered, including the heading that read, in bold type above the disclosure text, "Tobacco companies intentionally design cigarettes to make them more addictive." The statements were published as required. They appeared in the newspapers and on the websites their recipients read, in the measured, factual prose of court-mandated disclosure, the headings above them carrying the specific findings that the court had determined the public was owed. The formal stack of the master settlement agreement, its pages bound and indexed, its attachments and schedules running to considerable length beyond the core document, sat in the offices of state attorneys general across 46 states on the morning after its signing in November 1998. Each copy bore the same signature column on its final pages, the names running down the right margin in the careful handwriting of officials who had reached the end of a legal proceeding that had taken years to complete. The documents in those offices were identical to each other in their terms, and different only in the signature they bore, each one the conclusion of a separate legal history and the beginning of a set of ongoing obligations that would run for decades. Outside those offices, on a November morning, in cities and towns across the country, the settlement was being reported in the newspapers. The reporting described the monetary terms, the advertising restrictions, the required document disclosures. It described the dissolution of the Tobacco Institute and the Council for Tobacco Research. What the newspapers could not yet fully report was the specific content of the documents that the settlement's provisions would make public, the contents of the filing cabinets, the special projects files, the memoranda on industry letterhead, the research reports that had passed under the tent through legal counsel and then settled into the company archives to wait. The document's contents were not yet organized, not yet fully cataloged, not yet searchable in the way they would eventually become once they were housed in the archive. The settlement required the companies to fund. They were available. They were waiting for the researchers who would spend the following years moving through them, page by patient page, in the quiet of institutional reading rooms, assembling what the record showed, the physical stack of the settlement's pages, bound and indexed in the offices of 46 attorneys general on that November morning was a paper record of what 4 decades of institutional concealment had eventually required the industry to acknowledge in writing, in the binding, specific, legally enforceable language of a formal agreement, signed by the parties and filed in the courts, that would a large room in a Minnesota government facility during the winter months of early 1998 held something that had never been assembled before in quite this form. The boxes were stacked on industrial metal shelving in rows that ran the length of the room, each one labeled with a tobacco company name and a sequence of document numbers printed on adhesive paper and affixed to the side. The fluorescent lights above the shelving made a low, continuous sound. The boxes themselves were standard cardboard banker's boxes, the kind used in legal archives everywhere, and there were thousands of them, and inside them, in ordered folders and in stacked reams, were more than 35 million pages of internal corporate documents that the tobacco companies had been required by court order to produce. The room was quiet in the way that rooms full of paper are quiet, not empty but held. Nothing moved. The documents had traveled to this place from sealed corporate filing systems, from legal department storage facilities, from research archive rooms in buildings the public had never entered. And they had arrived here because a lawsuit filed by the state of Minnesota had compelled their release under terms that no prior tobacco litigation had managed to secure. The settlement that ended the Minnesota case required not only payment, but preservation, a permanent, publicly accessible depository where the documents would remain available to anyone who needed to read them. The room was that depository. It held, in its labeled rows of cardboard boxes, a version of the tobacco industry's private history that the industry itself had spent decades organizing carefully, away from any outside view. It is worth pausing on what 35 million pages means as a physical quantity. Stacked continuously, the documents in that room would have risen to a height that would take a person some minutes to describe. Laid flat across a surface, they would have covered an area larger than most of the buildings the documents had originally been stored in. The sheer accumulation was itself a record of something, not only of the industry's size and complexity, but of the volume of internal communication that had flowed through these companies over decades, while their public statements maintained a consistent and unified position on questions their own researchers had long since answered in the other direction. The boxes held letters and memoranda, research summaries and legal strategy notes, marketing analyses and scientific reports, and the routing marks on many of them indicated that they had passed through multiple offices, been read by multiple sets of eyes, and been filed in systems designed to make retrieval possible for those who knew how to look. The Minnesota Depository made the same retrieval possible now for those who had not been inside those systems at all. The road to that room had begun not in a courtroom, but in a law firm in Louisville, Kentucky, in the late 1980s, in a document review assignment given to a paralegal named Merrill Williams. Williams had been hired by a firm that represented Brown and Williamson, the tobacco company headquartered in Louisville, and his assignment was straightforward in its description, reviewing internal company documents for the purpose of legal case preparation, a task that required him to read through file after file and apply category codes to documents according to their relevance. He sat at a document review table day after day, working through the Brown and Williamson files. The company's documents moved past him in an ordered sequence: research reports, executive correspondence, legal analysis, internal scientific studies. He was being paid to read them. He read them carefully. What Williams encountered in those files Over the course of years of document review in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s was a sustained record of internal corporate knowledge that bore a particular relationship to what the company was saying in public. The documents he was reviewing described, in the company's own language, research findings about nicotine's pharmacological properties, internal discussions about the health effects of smoking, and communications about how the company should respond publicly to external scientific findings that it had in some cases replicated or exceeded in its own laboratories. He was not a scientist. He was a paralegal doing a document review job, but the accumulation of what the files contained was legible to him, and by the early 1990s, he had begun making photocopies of documents he believed were significant, not hundreds of pages at a time, but steadily, over the course of the work, building a collection of approximately 4,000 pages that he eventually removed from the firm. The photocopies Williams assembled represented a careful selection from the broader files he had reviewed. When they moved through successive stages of handling, from his possession to the attention of an attorney named Dickie Scruggs, who had been involved in tobacco litigation and understood immediately what the documents represented. Scruggs made the documents available to members of Congress who were then examining the tobacco industry's practices, and from there a set of the documents found its way to a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, named Stanton Glantz, who had spent years studying the tobacco industry's relationship to public health science. The path the documents traveled from Williams's photocopying sessions to Glantz's desk was not a single event, but a series of transfers, each one moving the material further from the sealed corporate systems it had originated in and closer to the public record it would eventually join. Glantz received a package in May of 1994. It arrived at his office at the University of California, San Francisco, through the mail, a padded envelope bearing no return address, its contents arranged in an order that suggested the sender had organized them deliberately before sealing the envelope for mailing. Inside were Brown and Williamson documents, a substantial portion of what Williams had copied, assembled and sent by an anonymous source whose identity Glantz did not know and could not confirm. The envelope arrived. He opened it. The documents it contained were internal corporate files from a major American tobacco company, and they included research findings, legal strategy memoranda, and correspondence that addressed directly the questions the tobacco industry had been publicly treating as unresolved for the better part of 4 decades. Glantz set to work on the documents with the methodological discipline of an academic researcher who understood what he was looking at. He was not the only person to receive or work with. Brown and Williamson materials that year, the congressional distribution Scruggs had arranged, meant that other sets of eyes were also reviewing the files, but Glantz's response was to build toward a systematic academic analysis that could be published in peer-reviewed form. He worked with colleagues at UCSF across the months that followed, and by 1995 they had produced an analysis substantial enough to occupy 6 simultaneous articles in a single issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association. The journal's editors described the publication event as among the most significant in the journal's history. The 6 articles together constituted the first time the Brown and Williamson documents had been examined and presented in peer-reviewed academic form, and their simultaneous publication in a single issue was a deliberate editorial choice, a way of conveying the scope and coherence of what the documents showed, which was not a fragment of corporate misconduct, but a sustained pattern of internal knowledge and external misrepresentation that stretched across years. The documents Glantz and his colleagues analyzed were not technically secret by the time the JAMA articles appeared. Brown and Williamson had sought a court injunction to prevent their publication, and for a period, the legal status of the documents was genuinely uncertain. The company argued that the files constituted stolen property and that their use in academic publication should be prohibited. The courts did not ultimately agree. The University of California system considered the matter and concluded that the documents fell within the tradition of academic research on matters of public concern, and the JAMA publication proceeded. The legal arguments Brown and Williamson made to prevent the analysis from reaching print were ultimately unsuccessful, but they were not casual efforts. The company pursued the injunction through multiple court proceedings, and the outcome was not foregone at the time it was being contested. What the documents showed, laid out across the 6 simultaneous JAMA articles in their peer-reviewed and footnoted form, was a company that had for decades possessed detailed internal knowledge of nicotine's pharmacological properties and tobacco smoke's carcinogenic characteristics, while maintaining in its public statements that no causal link had been conclusively established, and that the question of addiction remained scientifically open. The articles cited specific documents by their internal company numbering, quoted specific passages of corporate correspondence, and presented the internal research findings alongside the public statements issued in the same periods. The gap between them constituted the analysis itself. The documents did not require interpretation to convey what they showed. They required only assembly and comparison, which is what the JAMA analysis provided. The Minnesota case, running concurrently through the mid-1990s, was building toward a different kind of document release, not the targeted disclosure of a particular collection of files, but a court-ordered production of internal documents on a scale that dwarfed anything the prior litigation had compelled. The state's attorneys understood that the scope of discovery was one of the most powerful instruments available in a case against companies that had organized their document management specifically to limit what any outside party could access. The pretrial orders in the Minnesota case required tobacco companies to produce internal documents across a broad range of categories, and the companies produced them, more than 35 million pages, traveling through the formal discovery process into the Minnesota depository that would eventually hold them on its shelved rows of labeled banker's boxes. The settlement the Minnesota case produced in 1998, which required the companies to pay $6.6 billion to the state, was significant in its financial terms. What distinguished it procedurally, though, was the requirement that the companies fund a permanent public repository for the documents, not a court archive available only under supervised conditions, but a genuinely public depository where researchers could access the files without restriction. The companies had organized their document management for decades on the assumption that the files would remain internal, accessible only to those within the systems that held them. The Minnesota settlement required something more durable than a disclosure that could be contained within a single lawsuit. It required an institution. The institution that grew from this requirement took shape at the University of California, San Francisco. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library began accumulating materials from the Minnesota Depository and from other sources, documents produced in subsequent litigation, files voluntarily donated by researchers who had obtained them through various channels, materials declassified from sealed court proceedings as those proceedings concluded. The library grew steadily, and the scale it eventually reached was striking, not only in volume, but in the span of time the documents covered. The collection eventually held tens of millions of pages of internal tobacco industry documents, spanning more than a century of corporate communication, letters and memoranda from the mid-20th century, alongside research reports from the 1980s and 1990s. Legal strategy documents from the period immediately following the 1953 Winder mouse painting experiments, marketing analyses from every decade of the industry's modern history. The documents that researchers began finding in the legacy tobacco documents library when access was made available online were not uniformly dramatic in the way that the word internal documents sometimes suggests. Many of them were bureaucratic and routine, meeting minutes, expense reports, vendor correspondence, the ordinary paper residue of large organizations conducting their ordinary operations. What made the collection significant was precisely this texture of normalcy, because running through it were documents that addressed, in the same measured and bureaucratic register as everything else, questions the companies were answering very differently in public. A research summary circulated internally might describe findings about carcinogenicity in the language of a scientific report, noting the implications for product development. A legal strategy memo might discuss how to respond to a published study that replicated results the company's own researchers had obtained years earlier. An executive correspondence might address the question of what language to use in a press statement about a congressional inquiry. None of these documents announced themselves as exceptional. They were the ordinary output of companies at work, and that ordinariness was itself the record. Researchers working in the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library found over the years following its establishment a vocabulary that appeared with notable consistency across the internal documents of multiple companies. The term special projects appeared in the records of the Council for Tobacco Research, the industry body that had presented itself publicly as an independent scientific organization to describe a category of research funding that operated through a separate channel from the organization's publicly described grant programs. Documents bearing the word special projects in their headers had recipients identified only by initials, described research projects in terms that read like grant applications, but carried operational instructions that related to litigation preparation and the management of scientific testimony. The phrase "under the tent" appeared in correspondence describing the practice of routing sensitive scientific communications through outside legal counsel, a mechanism that allowed the companies to claim attorney-client privilege over research findings and internal scientific analyses that might otherwise have been subject to discovery in litigation. These were not colorful expressions. They were working vocabulary, used matter-of-factly in internal communication by people who understood what the terms referred to without needing to have them explained. The routing of scientific work under attorney-client privilege was not a simple or incidental practice. Documents in the collection described the mechanism in procedural terms. Research findings of a sensitive nature would be directed to outside legal counsel, who would then formally commission the research as legal work product, giving it a privileged status it would not otherwise have carried. The effect was to place a category of internal scientific knowledge behind a legal wall that could be invoked when the documents were sought in discovery. The practice was organized, and the documents describing it were organized, filed in systems, numbered, routed through the same bureaucratic channels as the rest of the corporate communication, which is how they survived to be read in the Minnesota Depository and in the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library, alongside the documents they had been designed to protect. What the documents in the collection revealed about the industry's research activities was not only that internal findings had been suppressed, but that some of what had been suppressed was technically sophisticated work conducted by trained researchers in properly equipped facilities. British American Tobacco's research operations in particular left a substantial documentary record in the collection. Internal research reports from the company's facilities describe studies in carcinogenesis and mutagenicity conducted with methodological rigor, work that addressed directly the questions the company was denying in public statements required any settled scientific answer. The research division had been staffed by scientists who communicated in the professional language of their disciplines, citing methods and interpreting results in terms recognizable to any researcher in the relevant fields. The findings they described internally were findings. They were not preliminary impressions or speculative observations. They were the conclusions of organized scientific work, and they lived in the files alongside the public statements that declined to acknowledge their existence. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library made this material available online, freely and without restriction, to any researcher with an internet connection. The decision to provide open digital access was not incidental to the library's purpose. It was central to it. The documents had been hidden inside corporate filing systems, partly because access to them required being inside those systems. Making them digitally searchable and openly retrievable was a direct inversion of that condition. A researcher at a university in another country could search the collection by keyword, by date range, by company, by document type, and receive scanned images of internal corporate files that had traveled from their original filing systems through court-ordered disclosure into this publicly accessible form. The library's search interface was not glamorous. It was the functional architecture of an archive. Text fields, date filters, document type categories. The glamour, if that is the right word, was in what the searches returned. The physical document depository in Minnesota and the digital collection at UCSF represented two expressions of the same underlying event, which was the forced migration of a body of corporate knowledge from a private system into a public one. The companies had organized their document management with the reasonable expectation, from the perspective of their own interests, that what was internal would remain internal. Litigation changed that expectation incrementally, case by case, state by state, through the accumulation of discovery orders and settlement requirements that each compelled a further release of material. The Minnesota case compelled more than any prior proceeding. The settlement terms that flowed from it created an institutional structure, the depository and its digital successor, that was designed to be permanent, not a disclosure event, but a disclosure condition that would persist indefinitely, regardless of what subsequent litigation produced or did not produce. The documents that eventually resided in the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library were not confined to a single company or a single decade. The collection held materials from Philip Morris, from R.J. Reynolds, from British American Tobacco, from Brown and Williamson, from the Lorillard Tobacco Company, from the Liggett Group, and from the industry bodies those companies had created and funded, the Council for Tobacco Research, the Tobacco Institute, and others. The span of time covered by the documents stretched from early 20th century corporate correspondence about cigarette manufacturing to communications from the 1990s about legal strategy in the period immediately preceding the major state lawsuits. Across that span, researchers found patterns that repeated, the same argumentative structures, the same categories of internal acknowledgement, alongside the same categories of external denial, the same vocabulary for managing the relationship between what the company's own scientists were finding and what the companies were saying in public. The patterns were not identical across all companies or all decades. They were recognizable. One company's documents illuminated another company's documents in the way that parallel texts sometimes clarify each other. The men and women who worked in the document review operations that produced the Minnesota disclosure were paralegal and legal staff doing the work of large-scale litigation preparation, categorizing files, applying codes, making the production of tens of millions of pages operationally possible. They were not, for the most part, people whose names attached to the history of this disclosure in the way that names sometimes attach to significant events. Merrill Williams is an exception to that pattern. His name became part of the record because his decision to photocopy and remove documents placed him visibly in the chain of events that brought the Brown and Williamson files to Stanton Glance's desk. But the Minnesota disclosure was a different kind of event, produced not by a single person's decision, but by the cumulative pressure of litigation in a jurisdiction whose courts were willing to compel a disclosure on an unprecedented scale. The settlement agreement that produced the Minnesota Depository was signed in May of 1998, 7 months before the broader Master Settlement Agreement that November brought 46 states into a single resolution with the 4 largest tobacco companies. The Minnesota settlement was structurally independent of the larger agreement, and its document depository requirement was not replicated in identical form in the national settlement. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library at UCSF drew on materials from both proceedings and from the later litigation that continued to produce disclosures after 1998, growing into a resource whose scope eventually exceeded what any single state settlement could have created. The library's accumulation was ongoing, not a fixed collection that reached a final form at a particular date, but an archive that continued to add materials as subsequent legal proceedings, research arrangements, and disclosure requirements brought new documents into its holdings. The scanned images the library served to researchers were not always clean. Documents that had lived in filing cabinets for decades sometimes arrived at the scanning stage, with the physical history of their storage visible on their surfaces, foxed margins, faint waterlines across the lower corners, the impression of a paperclip removed long ago from the upper right, rubber stamp marks applied when the document was first filed, and sometimes again when it was prepared for production. These physical traces were not obstacles to reading the documents. They were, in a quiet way, part of what the documents contained, evidence of the time they had spent in the systems that held them, the hands they had passed through, the physical existence they had maintained in sealed corporate filing rooms, while the companies that produced them were maintaining a different position in public. The researchers who used the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library in its early years were building what became a substantial body of academic literature, examining the tobacco industry's internal history. They published their findings in public health journals, in medical literature, in legal scholarship, in historical accounts. The documents they cited by their internal numbers and scanned identification codes became part of a cross-referenced academic record that made the contents of the collection increasingly legible. A finding in one article would point to documents that another researcher had cited in a different context, and the accumulation of these cross-references built something like a map of the collection, not a complete map, given the scale of what the library held, but a progressively more detailed one that made the patterns visible from multiple directions simultaneously. There is a particular quality to the stillness of an archive room at an early hour, before the day's researchers have arrived, and before the activity of the day has begun. The documents are present in their shelved or scanned forms, holding whatever they hold, available to whoever arrives to read them. The reading terminal at the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library, its screen displaying a scanned internal memo from the mid-1970s, its search interface waiting for the next query, the collection it represents extending through tens of millions of pages in its digital holdings, is itself a kind of document, a record of what litigation and legal strategy an archival commitment made possible of the slow journey that brought corporate files from sealed Louisville law firm cabinets and Southampton research corridors into this open and accessible form. The collection did not require a dramatic final moment to complete itself. It simply accumulated, document by document, disclosure by disclosure, case by case, into what it became, a library built from what was meant to stay hidden, sitting open on a server that any researcher anywhere could reach. The routes by which the documents traveled to this place were multiple, and they took different lengths of time. Some documents arrived through the formal machinery of litigation discovery, compelled by court orders and produced in response to legal process. Some arrived through individual decisions made by people who had encountered the files in the course of work they had been paid to do and concluded, for their own reasons, that the material should be seen by someone outside the corporate systems that held it. Some arrived through academic research arrangements, through settlement requirements, through the decisions of judges who found that the public interest in the document's accessibility outweighed the privilege claims the companies had organized to protect them. Each route was specific. Each had a particular history. Together they formed the path the collection traveled from its origins to the library that eventually held it. The room at the end of that path, the reading room at the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library at UCSF, its terminals available to researchers, its collection indexed and searchable, holds its materials in the particular stillness of an archive that knows its purpose and continues to serve it. A search entered into the terminal returns a scanned document, a memo from 1971, its header bearing a company logo and an internal routing stamp, its text visible in the scan, its routing marks showing the initials of the people it was sent to and the date it was filed. The memo says what it says in its own language, in the measured and professional register of corporate communication. It has been in the collection for years. It will remain in the collection. The terminal is still. The library continues to hold what it was built to hold, and the document on the screen has been there, in one form or another, since before the library existed, sealed in a filing system that expected it to remain sealed, and present now in this open and quietly glowing place, available at this hour and at any hour to any researcher who knows to look. In the Congressional Findings section of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, printed in the spare, unhurried typeface of federal legislation, there is a sentence that reads like a verdict arrived at after a very long wait. The act was signed on June 22, 2009. Its findings section records, in plain legislative prose, that the tobacco industry had concealed information about the health risks of its products and the addictive properties of nicotine for decades. The sentence does not elaborate. It does not name the years or the filing cabinets or the specific memos whose language contradicted every public statement the industry had made. It simply establishes the concealment as a matter of congressional finding, a formal public inscription of what the internal documents had shown, and then the legislation moves forward into its regulatory provisions, into its lists of authorities and timelines, into the administrative machinery that would follow from that single quiet acknowledgement. The act itself sits on a shelf in an FDA regulatory office, alongside the ingredient reports that tobacco companies now submit under its requirements. Those reports represent a category of document that did not exist before the act, a mandatory disclosure of what goes into cigarettes, filed by the same companies whose internal research divisions had spent decades studying precisely those ingredients while publicly characterizing the science as inconclusive. The shelf is not dramatic. The reports are not dramatic. They are the ordinary administrative residue of a legal framework that took roughly 55 years to materialize after the first significant epidemiological findings were published in the medical literature. 55 years is a long time for a fact to travel from a researcher's desk to a line in federal law. The Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act also reversed a Supreme Court ruling from the year 2000 in which the court had held in FDA v. SAP, Brown and Williamson Tobacco Corporation, that the FDA lacked the statutory authority to regulate tobacco products. That ruling had turned, in part, on an argument about what Congress had and had not authorized, an argument conducted at the level of statutory interpretation, while the legacy tobacco documents library was already open and already holding tens of millions of pages of evidence that the industry had understood its products' pharmacological properties with considerable precision for decades. The gap between what the document showed and what the legal framework had so far managed to address was, in 2000, still very wide. The 2009 Act narrowed it. It did not close it entirely. No single piece of legislation closes a gap of that duration entirely. What the regulatory record shows, when read alongside the documentary record, is a long and uneven process of institutional catch-up, the law moving toward a fact that the scientific literature had established decades earlier, the regulatory framework arriving, one statute and one ruling at a time, at conclusions that the industry's own research departments had documented in private correspondence before most of the regulatory bodies involved had even begun to ask the relevant questions. The Act of 2009 is, among other things, a measure of how long that distance was. There is a particular kind of document that began appearing in major American newspapers in November 2017, more than 11 years after the ruling that required it. A corrective statement, advertisement, placed by a tobacco company under court order occupies roughly a quarter page of newsprint. Its heading appears in bold type. Tobacco companies intentionally designed cigarettes to make them more addictive. Below the heading, in smaller type, several paragraphs of court-mandated disclosure follow, language that the companies had been required to publish, not by their own judgment, but by a judicial order that had survived appeals for over a decade before the specific language and placement requirements were finally settled. The advertisements ran in newspapers, they ran on company websites, they ran in television spots. They appeared in the quiet, slightly awkward visual idiom of mandatory disclosure, the kind of communication that is unmistakably coerced, that carries within its own format the evidence of how long it was delayed. The ruling that produced those advertisements was issued by U.S. District Judge Gladys Kessler in 2006, and it ran to 1,683 pages. 1,683 pages is an unusual length for a judicial ruling. It is the length of a document that must account for a very large volume of evidence accumulated over a very long period of time. Judge Kessler's findings included detailed analyses of specific internal documents, of the divergence between what company researchers had written in private and what company executives had said in public, of the mechanisms by which legal counsel had been used to route sensitive scientific communications into attorney-client privilege, of the specific language executives had been trained to use before congressional testimony. The ruling found that the major tobacco companies had violated the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It found that the violation was not a matter of omission or negligence. It found that the companies had engaged in a decades-long conspiracy to defraud the American public. The corrective advertisements that finally appeared in November 2017 were the result of that ruling, and the gap between the ruling and the first published advertisements 11 years, was itself a product of litigation over the specific form the disclosures should take. The original ruling had proposed remedies that were challenged on First Amendment grounds and modified and appealed and sent back through the courts until in 2017 the language and the placement and the size requirements were finally fixed. The advertisements carry, then, a kind of accumulated legal history inside their plain black and white frames. They are not simply disclosure. They are the residue of roughly 60 years of concealment, followed by a decade of litigation over how to describe it. The pattern that those advertisements document, the deliberate design of a product to enhance its addictive properties, was among the findings that public health researchers had begun to trace in a different direction by the time the corrective statements appeared. Internal documents obtained through congressional investigation into the electronic cigarette company Juul revealed that the company had conducted research into youth nicotine use, had data indicating its products were being used by teenagers in significant numbers, and had made specific product design choices, including the formulation of nicotine salts at concentrations significantly higher than those found in traditional cigarettes, and the development of flavored pods in varieties calibrated to appeal to younger users. Public health researchers reviewing those documents characterized the patterns they described as methodological continuations of strategies that were already fully documented in the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library is a specific institution, a repository housed at the University of California, San Francisco, containing tens of millions of pages of internal tobacco industry documents made available under court orders and settlement agreements going back to the late 1990s. Its holdings span more than a century of corporate communications, research reports, legal strategy memos, and internal scientific studies. It is searchable. It is freely accessible online to any researcher with an internet connection. When public health researchers working on Juul cited its holdings in their analysis, they were drawing a documented line between specific product design strategies and the corporate communications that had described those strategies in different language in a different decade, in an industry that had presented itself publicly as operating on entirely different principles. The Congressional Investigation Report on Juul contains footnotes that cite both internal Juul documents and specific document numbers from the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library. A page from that report, with its 2 columns of evidence running down the page in parallel, one set of citations from documents produced in the early 21st century, one set from documents produced in the 1960s and 1970s, is a particular kind of historical artifact. It is a page that demonstrates in its own format that the archived record of one industry's internal knowledge has become a reference point for understanding the internal knowledge of another. The library was built to hold what it holds. It was not built to predict what it would eventually be used to illuminate. The use of the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library as a comparative reference is not limited to research on electronic cigarettes. Researchers studying the strategies of other industries that have faced adverse scientific evidence, industries dealing with products and materials whose health effects became subjects of significant public health concern, have examined the tobacco documents as a kind of methodological archive, a record of how a corporation or an industry can organize its response to unwanted scientific findings across multiple decades. The tobacco industry's approach, funding alternative research, maintaining the appearance of scientific controversy, rooting sensitive communications through legal counsel, training spokespersons to speak the language of caution rather than denial, was not invented in a vacuum. It was refined over decades, documented in millions of pages of internal communications, and eventually made publicly available. The availability of that record has made it a resource for researchers trying to understand how similar strategies operate in different institutional contexts. The documents that describe those strategies are now housed in a room that was built specifically to hold them. That room is a remarkable institutional fact. The tobacco industry spent decades routing its most sensitive communications through legal departments and outside counsel specifically to prevent those communications from becoming part of any accessible record. The Minnesota litigation, the state settlements, the master settlement agreement, the specific court orders that required companies to produce and then to fund the permanent preservation of their internal documents. The entire long legal sequence that ended with tens of millions of pages in a publicly accessible repository represents the inversion of that strategy. The documents that were most carefully protected from disclosure are now among the most thoroughly indexed and searchable corporate records in existence. There is a think tank, there are several think tanks, whose financial records, examined alongside the tobacco documents, reveal a relationship between the industry's funding and the organization's policy output that was obscured through intermediaries. Post-2000 financial disclosure research has identified organizations that received tobacco industry funding and produced policy analyses opposing tobacco regulations, with the connections running through multiple layers of organizational structure, foundations funding foundations, grants arriving from sources whose origins are not immediately traceable in the public record. Public health researchers studying these relationships have characterized the structural approach as a continuation of strategies already documented in the tobacco archive. Strategies for maintaining the appearance of independent scientific and policy debate, while the funding relationships run in a different direction beneath the surface of the institutional record. The tobacco archive is large enough that specific document numbers in footnotes are not unusual. A researcher working in the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library can call up by document number a specific internal memo from a specific date, can see the routing stamps, the initials, the marginal notations made by someone who received the memo in an office that no longer exists in an industry that was, at that moment, engaged in a strategy the memo's author almost certainly understood was not designed to survive public scrutiny. The memo is searchable now. Its document number is citable. Its contents are part of a body of evidence that has been analyzed in peer-reviewed journals, cited in judicial rulings, reproduced in congressional investigation reports, and indexed in a publicly accessible archive that any person with an internet connection can search at any hour of the day or night. The World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is a treaty, a specific document, ratified by more than 180 countries, its text specifying obligations related to tobacco advertising, warning labels, smoke-free environments, and the protection of public health policy from commercial interference. The convention's ratification process was not frictionless. Internal documents and investigative reporting produced evidence that major international tobacco companies engaged in organized efforts to slow or soften ratification in developing country signatories, cultivating relationships with government officials, funding local opposition, framing public health measures as trade barriers, deploying the vocabulary of economic development in countries where the industry's projections for market growth were significant. Those efforts replicated, in broad structure, the lobbying and public relations strategies that the American tobacco industry had deployed domestically from the 1950s onward. A ratification document from a lower-income signatory nation, a formal treaty document bearing the signatures of health ministers alongside the text of the convention's articles, sits in a National Health Ministry archive in a capital city that was, in the years leading up to ratification, the site of organized industry opposition to the treaty's implementation. The ratification document and the internal industry communications describing the opposition campaign are not in the same archive. They are held in different countries, in different institutions, accessible through different processes. The relationship between them is one that researchers have assembled from multiple sources, tracing the industry's international strategy across the same decades in which its domestic strategy was being assembled into the American public record through litigation and settlement. The Framework Convention was opened for signature in 2003 and entered into force in 2005. Its text includes a provision, Article 5.3, that specifically addresses the obligation of parties to protect their public health policies from the commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry. Article 5.3 is a treaty provision of a kind that did not exist before the Tobacco Archive was assembled. It is language that reflects what the archive documented, the specific mechanisms by which an industry can insert itself into public health policymaking, and the specific institutional arrangements that allow that insertion to continue for extended periods without becoming part of the official record. The provision is, in a quiet way, a legislative response to a documentary record. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library continues to accumulate. The original holdings from the state litigation and the Master Settlement Agreement have been supplemented by documents produced in subsequent litigation, by materials deposited voluntarily by researchers, and by digital archives of tobacco industry advertising and promotional materials. The library's catalog is ongoing. The documents it holds were produced across more than a century of corporate activity, and the analysis of those documents is a research enterprise that has not concluded. New analyses appear in the scientific literature, drawing on specific documents or document sets from the archive. New relationships between documents are identified. New patterns are found in correspondence that has been in the archive for years, but has not previously been read in the context of a particular question. The library is open. That is a simple institutional fact that carries in the context of this particular history a particular weight. The documents that the industry routed through legal departments to prevent their disclosure, the documents that were withheld in litigation for decades, the documents that traveled from sealed corporate filing systems through court orders and settlement negotiations, and the specific conditions attached to the Minnesota case. Those documents are now retrievable by anyone who knows a document number or a keyword or a date range. The institutional effort that went into preventing their disclosure was very large. The institutional effort that went into making them accessible was also very large. The documents themselves are now quiet. They sit in servers. They are indexed. It is worth attending to the specific texture of a document in the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library, what it looks like on a reading room screen, what the scan reveals. An internal memo from the mid-1970s, called up by document number, shows the company's header at the top of the page, a logo, a location, a date typed in the format of that decade's business correspondence. Below the header, a routing stamp shows 3 initials and a date of receipt. The body of the memo is typed in a proportional typeface, its margins generous, its language the measured prose of corporate communication, precise about what it describes, cautious in its framing, written by someone who understood both the scientific question being addressed and the institutional context in which the question was being managed. The marginal notations visible in the scan were made by the person who received the memo, They are brief. They do not explain themselves. They are the residue of a conversation that took place in an office that has long since been reorganized and whose participants have not, in most cases, given any subsequent account of that conversation. What the marginal notation says and what it does not say are both part of the archive now. The memo is one of tens of millions of similar documents. Its individual content may or may not be significant. Its existence, the fact of its preservation, the fact of its accessibility, the fact that it can be called up and examined by a researcher who was not yet born when the memo was written, is itself a consequence of the particular legal and institutional history that produced the archive. The filing cabinet it once occupied is gone. The office it once occupied is gone. The memo is still here. The corrective advertisements that appeared in 2017 ran alongside other advertising in major American newspapers, beside the ordinary commercial communications of other industries. The retail announcements, the entertainment listings, the real estate columns. They did not look like other advertising. Their format, plain black and white, mandated text, the heading in bold above the paragraphs of required disclosure, carried its coercive origin in its design. A reader encountering one in November 2017 was encountering a document that had in a sense been in preparation since the mid-1990s, when the state lawsuits began assembling the evidentiary record that would eventually support Judge Kessler's 2006 findings. The advertisement in the newspaper was the final public-facing form of a process that had run for roughly 20 years through depositions and document productions and appellate proceedings. It was, by the time it appeared, very quiet. It occupied its quarter page of newsprint and said what it was required to say. The Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, the corrective advertisements, the Framework Convention's Article 5. 3. The footnotes in congressional investigation reports citing legacy document numbers. These are not the end of anything. They are the current shape of a record that continues. The tobacco archive is not a closed collection. The regulatory and legal framework built around the documentary record continues to generate new documents, new filings, new analyses, new proceedings in which the existing archive is cited and extended. The shape of what was concealed and the shape of what the concealment eventually required are both still visible in the documents the archive holds. There is a quality to a very large archive, tens of millions of pages, a century of corporate communications, that is different from the quality of a single document or a single finding. A single document can be surprising. A single finding can be striking. A very large archive has a different character. It is comprehensive in a way that individual documents are not. It records not only the significant decisions and the significant communications, but also the ordinary ones, the routing slips, the scheduling memos, the distribution lists, the brief notes attached to documents being forwarded from one desk to another. It records the texture of institutional life across decades. It records in its aggregate the shape of an organization's internal knowledge. What was known, who knew it, how knowledge moved through the organization, where it was stopped, and by what means. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library holds that quality of comprehensiveness. It is, by the measures of archival science, an extraordinary collection, not only for its size, but for its character as a record of organizational knowledge, specifically in the context of that knowledge's relationship to external facts the organization was managing. The archive shows, across decades and across multiple companies, how an institution can hold a body of scientific knowledge in its internal communications while maintaining a different position in its public communications. The gap between those two positions is documented in millions of pages of ordinary business correspondence. A reading room terminal at the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library, its screen lit in the early morning, quiet before the day's researchers have arrived, displays a scanned internal memo from 1971. The document's header is visible. The routing marks are visible. The text of the memo is indexed and searchable. The library around the terminal is still outside. The world is at whatever hour it has reached. The long, quiet hours of early morning. The particular stillness of an institutional building before the working day begins. The servers that hold the archive are running. The documents are there. The archive was built to hold them, and it holds them, and it continues to hold them in the still of a morning when no one is yet searching.